This is part 3 of Robert Temple's A New Science of Heaven. In this segment, we will go through at least chapter 6 and possibly chapter 7. We'll just see how it be. I want to apologize to anyone who's listened to the last few parts, where, especially the last video in part 2, where I kind of get a bit tired. I mean, it was like 12 or 1 o'clock in the morning and I'm practically falling asleep. So I gotta do these recordings a lot earlier in the night than that. Because I don't want to take any kind of caffeine at night. That's, counterintuitive, counterproductive in a way. Because then I'd be up until like 3 in the morning depending on what it is. But either way, that's neither here nor there. So we're doing this earlier in the night, so that way hopefully I don't fall asleep. So, and it's not because the material's boring. So don't get it twisted. Don't get your brain all twisted. Got my brain all twisted. Anyways, let's see. Temple set down a pretty good foundation in the first few chapters to at least get people interested, I would hope. I mean, I was certainly interested when I first read it. So, so without further ado, let's get to the text. We got chapter 6. When heaven was young, forever young. For the whole of recorded human history, many traditions and tales have survived where humans in a state of meditation or reverie have encountered glowing balls of fire of a divine nature. Let us take a look now at some of these ancient accounts. They provide historic evidence of great importance to us. About 2,000 years ago, there was a very widespread religious tradition in the Middle East and Mediterranean based upon what we now call plasma entities. It was a light theology, quote unquote, called Gnosticism. And Gnosticism has entered the chat. I mean, it's not that I picked this book just after reading What is Gnosticism by Karen L. King. I just like this book, to be honest. I think it's a really good book. So I've kind of forgot that he starts off with Gnosticism in chapter 6. He talks about Aristotle and others, not as Gnostics, I mean, but he gets to other traditions besides Gnosticism, anyways. There were many schools, quote unquote, and groups and churches of Gnosticism, somewhat similar to the way in which there are many Protestant sects today. The word Gnostic, quote unquote, is a modern invention, exactly, which scholars use to describe them collectively. It comes from the Greek word gnosis, we already know this, which means knowledge, quote unquote, but amongst the people we now call Gnostics, the word took a deeper meaning of sacred knowledge, quote unquote, or of higher knowledge, quote unquote. The Gnostics believed that an, uh, an elect group of people of spiritual inclinations who pursued sacred knowledge would constitute the section of the human population who would survive the vicissitudes of the corrupt world of physical matter, and after their physical deaths would enter a kingdom of light. I mean, I guess that's like a general a general sense of it, in which resided a variety of plasmic deities culminating in the Father. He's quote unquote. This is a very generalized sense of Gnosticism or groups in Gnosticism. But anyways, this was a name they used for the highest God of all. Jesus used this very term himself, and instead of speaking of the kingdom of light, he spoke of the kingdom of the Father. The light emitted by the Father, quote unquote, is described in Gnostic texts as being stronger than 10,000 times 10,000 suns. Quote, the Father, end quote, had no physical body, but was essentially what might perhaps be called a light ball or plasma ball. A Dragon Ball? Probably not. Those who were saved, quote unquote, would themselves put on vestures of light, quote unquote, and become mini plasma balls and would live forever in a heavenly plasma world. Oh, it seems like he's heavily putting on to the text, but we'll just let that slide for now. At least he's giving quotes. In the lengthy and well-preserved Gnostic text known as the Pistis or Pistis Sophia, the following conversation between Mary Magdalene, who in the Gnostic tradition was one of the main disciples of Jesus, and Jesus is recorded, quote, Maria came forward. She worshipped at the feet of Jesus and said, my Lord, be not angry with me that I question thee, for thou hast once said to us, seek and ye shall find. My Lord and my Savior, of what kind are the 24 invisible ones, and of what type, or what form are they, or of what form is their light? Jesus answered, however, and said to Maria, what is there in this world that resembles them, or rather, what place is there in this world that is comparable to them? Truly, truly, I say to you, the 24 invisible ones are lighted 10,000 times 10,000 times more than the light of the sun, which is in this world, as I have already said to you at another time. For the light of the sun is in its true form is not in this place, because its light passes through a multitude of veils of places. But the light of the sun in its true form, which is in the place of the Virgin of the light, is lighted 10,000 times more than the 24 invisible ones and the great invisible forefather and also the triple powered God, as I have already said to you another time. Now at this time, Maria, there is no kind in this world, nor light nor form, which compares with the 24 invisible ones. But yet a little, and I will take thee with thy brothers and fellow disciples to all the places of the height, and you will look forth upon the whole world of mankind, and it will become the size of a speck of dust before you as a result of the great distance. End quote. Interesting how it says dust there. But I mean that's like a modern translation, I'm sure, into English. Gnosticism was strong in both Judaism and in Christianity though we know that it existed in Judaism long before Jesus, so was earlier than the earliest forms of Christianity. Why does that sentence seems kind of weird to me? So was earlier than the earliest forms of Christianity. We should bear in mind that Jesus was not a Christian, quote unquote, but a Jew. Uh, we'll just let that slide. Some people get triggered. Christianity, quote unquote, had not been invented yet. It was named later based on his upon his sayings after the Greek word Christos, meaning anointed, quote unquote, which was itself uh, a direct translation of the Hebrew word Messias, that we pronounce Messiah, which also means anointed, quote unquote. Um, Maybe that's, I mean, I'm not sure if that's exactly correct, if my memory serves right. Messiah, at least for contextual reasons, Messiah is not the same as Christ. Messiah, at least in the Jewish context, was more in, I mean, obviously the ruler of the Israelites would be anointed as the king. I mean, so there is overlap, but also at the same time, it's not necessarily what exactly the Greeks meant by Christos. Anyway, I'm not going to get too tangled up in that. The Jewish Gnostics had an esoteric and secret reinterpretation of the Old Testament texts, maintaining that the book of Genesis was an allegory. Some extremely strange interpretations are put forward in their writings. For instance, they maintained that Noah did not really build an ark at all, but that he hid inside a glowing light cloud, which we would call a plasmoid. The Gnostic texts are full of descriptions of plasma and plasmoids, often in a often in surprising detail. When gathered together from the many texts that we now have, vastly expanded by the discovery at Nag Hammadi in 1945, the finally edited, annotated, and translated texts of which became available at last towards the end of the 20th century. A whole world of plasma entities is revealed. Ruh-roh. Ruh-roh. Where are we at? Ruh-roh. Plasma revealed. Gnosticism conceived of an entire plasma universe. It seemed that ancient seers were able to perceive clearly what we are now only now able to demonstrate scientifically and recreate in advanced modern laboratories. Manichaeism, founded by a prophet called Mani, once stretched from Europe to China, though it is now vanished. It too was a light religion, quote unquote, describing plasma phenomena, its origins lying partly in the earlier Gnosticism. Gnosticism itself survived as a mass movement until the extermination of the Cathars in southern France during the Middle Ages and the fading away of the Bogomils of Bulgaria and the Massalians of Slavic Europe at some unknown time, apparently by the 16th century. You know, I never really hear about these Massalians. Might have to look into that. I don't know. The most famous example of an intelligent glowing plasma in ancient Western quote unquote religious literature is probably the burning bush quote unquote encountered by Moses on the top of Mount Horeb in Sinai. I should point out that to all the modern tourists who mistakenly climb Mount Sinai, that it is the wrong mountain. Mount Horeb, being further south, is rarely visited because there is no easy way up it. At its summit is a magnificent temple of Hathor, whose cult image was the face of a calf, a golden Hathor calf, a golden Hathor calf. Of that temple was the golden calf, quote unquote, of the Bible, though no one has realized this yet. Oh, I think people might have. The Moses story is well known to all Christians and Jews and to Muslims as well, since Muslims are Abrahamic, quote unquote, by tradition, and Moses preceded Abraham. Say what? Moses preceded Abraham? Yeah, I don't know why I would say that. Moses preceded Abraham. Not chronologically, not by lineage. I'm not sure what he's talking about. I'm just a slow boy with no whiteboard, I guess you could say. The account is to be found in the book of Exodus, chapter 3, verse 2, the second book, the burning bush, in other words, the second book of the Old Testament of the Christian Bible, as well as the Jewish Torah. Moses encountered this brilliantly shining and burning plasma, which spoke to him, and he described it as being like a burning bush that was, however, not consumed by its own flames. In other words, it was not a real bush, but was round and burning, quote unquote, as if it were a bush, which is the only way a person of that early pre scientific time could hope to describe it. The voice may have been audible to the ears, or it may only have been mentally audible, quote unquote, telepathic. Although many deeply religious people who do not necessarily study these texts carefully believe that the burning bush was God, quote unquote, or Jehovah. The text is not clear on that point. It says actually that the angel of the Lord, quote unquote, appeared to Moses as a burning bush, but not that the Lord himself appeared to Moses. That is very different. In one of the translations, the English Standard Version, we are told, quote, and the angel of the Lord appeared to him, Moses, in a flame of fire from the midst of a bush, end quote. The Septuagint is also confused because although the apparition is said to be the angel of the Lord, quote unquote, the Lord himself is also apparently watching, and when he sees Moses approaching, he too cries out from the bush himself and calls Moses by name, telling him not to approach closer. So who was it, the angel of the Lord or the Lord himself? As I say, this is not at all made clear by the text. This confused story seems to have only one reliable element to it. In the absence of the original Hebrew text, which is lost more than 2,000 years ago, and that element is the bush-like burning apparition that, quote, did not consume itself, end quote, but continued to burn apparently without any fuel. In other words, this seems to be a description of an encounter with a glowing plasma ball or blazing plasmoid which spoke, and encounters with such apparitions are to be found throughout the religious and sacred literatures of many countries over the millennia, and are also recorded by the more mystically inclined ancient Greek philosophers. In fact, what is described as happening to Moses is something that has happened countless times to sages, shamans, meditators, yogis, and holy men throughout the ages. An analysis of many of these encounters could shed a great deal of light, uh, no pun intended, upon the interactions throughout the history between spiritual quote unquote plasma forms of beings, whether higher entities, quote unquote, or deceased persons. Ah, snake. What is that? I guess that's God. We have figure 5. The angel of the Lord speaks to Moses from the burning bush, top left center corner. The snake may refer to the transformation of Moses' staff. This image is from an illustrated Latin Bible of 1567. Snake, snake. The great scholar of Judaism, Gershom Scholem, argues that the figure known as Moses, whether mythical, real, and partially mythical, seems to have been responsible for changing the religion of the Jews into a monotheistic religion and for treating the earlier Jewish ideas of as heretical, quote unquote. But those heresies, quote unquote, persisted nevertheless for centuries. And today we describe them as Gnostic Judaism, quote unquote. They were in turn taken over by Gnostic Christianity, quote unquote, which was as ferociously persecuted by the Roman Catholic Church, self-styled self-styled Christian orthodoxy, quote unquote, as the Pharisees were by the Sadducees, self-styled Jewish orthodoxy, quote unquote. But now we turn away from Moses to consider another early Jewish prophet, Enoch. Here is an encounter of the prophet Enoch with divine radiance as recounted in the book of Enoch, in which we must note the mention of an entity called the Great Glory, quote unquote, which is reminiscent of the angel of the Lord, quote unquote, who was called the Glory, quote unquote, by the Samaritans. Quote, and the vision appeared to me thus: behold, in the vision clouds invited me. I drew nigh to a wall which is built of crystals, and surrounded by a fiery flame, and it began to affright me. And when I went into the fiery flame, and a flaming fire surrounded the walls of the house, and its portal blazed with fire. And I entered into that house, and it was hot as fire. And lo, there was a second house, greater than the former, all the portals of which stood open before me, and it was built of flames of fire. And its floor was fire, and above it were lightnings, and its ceiling also was flaming fire. And I looked and saw therein a lofty throne, as a shining sun, and from underneath the great throne came streams of flaming fire, so that it was impossible to look thereon. And the great glory sat thereon, and his raiment shone more brightly than the sun, and was whiter than any snow. A flaming fire was round about him, and a great fire stood before him. Uh, and until then, I had a veil of on my face, and I was trembling. End quote. Later, Enoch also relates, quote, they took me away to a place where there were forms like flaming fire, and when they when they wished, they appeared as men, end quote. In other words, he is describing higher beings who normally had the forms of plasma entities, but who could take on human form for interactions with humans. It should be noted that the Book of Enoch is an ancient Jewish work dating from before the time of Jesus, which clearly discussed divine beings capable of incarnating as men. The Book of Enoch is regarded as a canonical work of scripture by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which is one of the earliest Christian churches. Figure 6, William Blake's 1807 lithograph of Enoch in Heaven. See, I don't really, it's like something, this guy's reading a scroll, got a harp, we got like flora, there's some grapes, I guess grapes. I mean, there's some symbolism. That guy looks like he's got a painter's board, where you call those things, where you just, he's like painting, I guess. Enoch's got a book. I'm not sure what this chick's doing. I think that's a chick. Anyways, yeah, I don't know enough about symbolism to unpack that. But continuing, the Platonic philosopher Damascius, 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 458 to 550 AD, so like middle or Neoplatonist, perhaps. Platonic philosopher Damascius believes that the human spirit was, quote, a radiant body filled with heavenly radiance, a glory that streams through its depths and lends it a divine strength. But in lower states, losing its radiance, it is dirtied, as it were, and becomes darker and darker and more material. End quote. The philosopher Philo- Philoponus of Alexandria, 490 to 570 AD, believed that this spirit was a higher soul attached to the basic soul. In other words, he believed, as did the ancient Egyptians, in more than one level of soul for each person. He wrote, quote, "There is, moreover, beyond the soul another kind of body that is forever attached to the soul, which they call radiant or star-like. And, oh, we got star seeds up in here. Anyways, and it forever keeps its radiant body, which is of an everlasting nature," end quote. The Jewish Gnostic treatise discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, The Apocalypse of Adam, features Adam speaking to his son Seth and saying that before he and Eve were thrown out of the garden, they had gone about in a radiant and glowing condition. He says that when the descendants of Seth return eventually from earth to the divine regions, they will all become clouds of great light. And he also speaks a great deal in general about radiant clouds of glory. In the early Christian Gnostic text discovered at Nag Hammadi in 1945, entitled Marsanis, the narrator says, quote, "The third shape of the soul is spherical," end quote. There is considerable unanimity amongst many of the mystical texts of antiquity that men and higher entities alike have souls that are radiant and gloating spheres. This reminds me of Michael, what's his name? Michael Newton, who was a past life regressionist. He talked about different souls having different hues of light and stuff like that. I mean, whether that's correct or not is remains to be seen. But it kind of ties in with all this verbiage of light and radiance. Men who become too attached to earth cease to radiate light and go dark, thus resembling the fallen angels who have become demons of darkness. I mean, it's a lot of symbolism like that that's going on. I think of some other legends such as Lilith. It kind of is, at least by according to some people, it was kind of like that. She grew, her appearance went kind of dark, and she changed form, as it were. But I mean, that's a whole different can of worms. I'm not gonna get into that anytime soon. Where was I? The demons of darkness, yada yada yada. Another Nag Hammadi Gnostic text, the paraphrase of Shem, is full of descriptions of heavenly clouds of fire, quote unquote, garments of light, quote unquote, luminous spirits, quote unquote, images of light, quote unquote, the power of restless fire, quote unquote, the light of spirit, quote unquote, the exalted infinite light. Headset turned off. Sad trombone. Moving on. The exalted infinite light, quote unquote, power, clouds of power, quote unquote, clouds of light, quote unquote, the cloud of silence, which is a majestic fire, quote unquote, garments of fire, quote unquote, a power of fire and light, quote unquote, thought that comes forth from light, quote unquote, and says, quote, the righteous spark is the cloud of light that has shone in your midst, end quote. Ideas such as the garments of light and fire seem as if they might allude to the presence of plasma and in and around the human body, which we will return to in the final chapters of the book. Also think of in the book of Revelation, where the saints that overcome are given clothed in white garment. So it's like a illusion, uh, you know, an allusion to light, the garments of light. I forget what chapter and verse that is. I want to say that's chapter 2 or chapter 3, where Jesus is talking to the seven churches, and he's talking about how certain groups that overcome will have certain rewards, as it were. Anyways, um, ideas such as the garments of light and fire seem as if they might allude to the presence of plasma in and around the human body, which we will return to in the final chapters of the book. One of the most famous and impressive of the Nag Hammadi texts is the Apocryphon of John. Well, here we go again, which is dated to the early part of the 3rd century AD. It is full of descriptions of luminous clouds, quote unquote. Such a luminous cloud is mentioned in particular in the text's alternative story of Noah. The text says that the story of Noah and the ark, quote, is not as Moses said, end quote. Moses was here presumed to be the author of the book of Exodus, which he is not. But the true story is very different. We are told that Moses was wrong in saying that saying of Noah that, quote, he hid himself in an ark, end quote, because he had been warned that the flood is coming. The text insists that it was not Noah alone, quote unquote, but also other men, quote unquote. And we are told that, quote, they went into a place and sheltered themselves within a luminous cloud, quote unquote. The text also speaks of angels as lights, quote unquote. However, it is not only the good entities, but also the bad entities who reside in luminous clouds. The Gnostic name for the devil is the chief archon, who also called Samael, Yaldabaoth, and Saklas. Oh dear, which means the fool, quote unquote. Here we go, Samael and Demiurge and all this nonsense, right? We shall see. The text tells us that the chief archon, quote, created for himself an aeon, a special place that burns with a luminous fire, the one in which he exists now, end quote. The Gnostics altered the meaning of the ancient Greek word aeon, and used it for their own peculiar way. In their own peculiar way, the term aeon, the Latin form that we use in English, occurs constantly in their texts. In other words, the devil himself lives in a fiery plasma cloud. So consequently, both the powers of good and the powers of evil dwell in or consist of plasma clouds. So could that be the Kordylewski clouds? Maybe? Herm. We shall see about that. Perhaps. The war in heaven is thus a war between good and bad plasmas, and the extent to which they can recruit humans on their respective sides is assumed to have a bearing on how long the world will last before it reaches its ultimate climax, when the final reckoning occurs. At that time, the elect, quote unquote, amongst humanity who have remained good despite all temptations will rise up to the kingdom of light, and the powers of darkness will be annihilated. Which groups has this particular type of eschatology? Um, you need to be more specific, I think, my good man. Humanity has been inundated with such accounts of what we would call using the terminology of science, divine plasma entities for millennia, but most people have tended to disregard them as either fantasies or the enthusiastic reveries of people who were not entirely sane. But but they constitute massive evidence of phenomena experienced by sensitive and meditative persons in all cultures around the world. Now at last, science has caught up with mysticism, and modern physicists are seriously suggesting that intelligent plasma beings can exist after all. Excuse me. Pause. Definitely don't want to cough on my own recording. Are plasma entities to be regarded as helpful or harmful to us? The traditions are explicit that they can be both, but the helpful ones are radiant with light, whereas the harmful ones are dark and perverse, as their light has been contaminated and made obscure with the dirt of corruption. It is it is time that humans were given a proper briefing on this material world of the spirit, quote unquote. This is a short survey of some of the myriad descriptions of light phenomena in ancient religions. Of course, key events in the New Testament, such as the Transfiguration, where Jesus appeared radiant in glory, and the Pentecost, where tongues of light appeared hovering over the heads of the apostles, also suggestive of plasma and plasmas. Aristotle's Pneuma. Although the word plasma, quote unquote, was only coined in 1928, some thinkers in the ancient world had an idea of it. For reasons of space, I am going to confine myself to two examples where the ancient examples, use your words, mate, to two examples where the ancient examples are startlingly close to our modern ideas. Something very strange was going on in the 4th century BC, and I call it Aristotle's anticipation of plasma's physics and bioplasma. Aristotle 384 to 322 BC. He's often thought of as a rather dry character who wrote profound philosophical tomes that only very serious-minded people try to read. However, the real Aristotle was very different. He published 2 books of poems, and 3 of his poems actually survived. Another thing is that he freed all his slaves, some during his lifetime and all the rest in his will. Yeah, well, no one's perfect. He had some other shit going on too. Um, One of the reasons he had to flee Athens for his life was when he was 62 years old is that he had written an ode to his deceased wife, and the high view he had of women was considered offensive to the male chauvinists of ancient Athens, who liked to keep women in their place, i.e., either on their backs or sitting at the spinning wheel, and not allowed out of the house without chaperones. Moreover, furthermore, rather, Aristotle was that horrible and despised thing, a foreigner. He was born in the north of Greece, and he was a resident alien in Athens. Significantly for this volume, Aristotle was the first Western thinker to postulate the existence of a rarefied form of matter entirely separate and wholly different from physical matter. He named it Aether. Aether, I don't the Greek pronunciation, which we spell aether or ether today in English, and the old-fashioned English spelling was aether. It was probably pronounced ether back then, though no one uses that spelling anymore. Since physical matter was then conventionally spoken of as made of earth, air, fire, water, quote unquote. Aristotle called his new form of matter the fifth element, quote unquote. In Latin, this is quinta essentia, which is the origin of our English word quintessence, quote unquote. This was the first time in recorded history that plasma had been anticipated. I am still struck today by the startling boldness of Aristotle, who also questioned the nature of matter in such a fundamental way. Aristotle's aether was viewed by him as a form of matter that existed in the pure state only in what today we would call outer space, quote unquote, but was then called the region above the moon, quote unquote. Aristotle thus anticipated our modern knowledge of plasma in physics. If he were alive today, Aristotle would not be surprised to be told that the sun was entirely composed of plasma and that the space between the sun and the earth was filled with a solar wind made also of plasma. For this is what he had predicted. Aristotle went much further than only proposing that there was a higher form of matter. He actually proposed that each living physical body had a corresponding etheric body, or what is now called by some modern scientists a bioplasma body, quote unquote. We will hear much more about bioplasma bodies later on. Makes me think of Bob Becker's book, Body Electric. I might read that eventually for the channel. I don't know. His writings on this subject are mostly lost and survive only in fragments. Some of those lost writings were dialogues rather than treatises. It is little known today that Aristotle was as famous for his dialogues in his own day as was Plato. But such are the vagaries of what survives and what does not, that not a single one of Aristotle's dialogues survives in its entirety, and and the and those fragments that do survive as quotations by Cicero and others are tantalizing in their brevity. We are we are somewhat luckier with what are called the testimonia, quote unquote, which means the descriptions of rather than the quotations from the lost dialogues. But even so, we get only a glimpse of Aristotle's discussions of his theories of a fifth element. It is worthwhile giving a bit more detail about what Aristotle believed, since few classical scholars have made a proper study of this aspect of his ideas. The scholar who has advanced a study of this subject the most is Professor A.P. Bose of the Netherlands, or Bose, who publishes most of his writings in English. He has cracked the code, quote unquote, of many of Aristotle's ideas, which have been only partially preserved, and this has taken him decades. Much of the information that made this possible is to be found in the philosophical dialogues of Cicero and in the writings of Philo and of Clement of Alexandria, and in a fascinating essay by Plutarch of the first century AD entitled on the face of on the face which appears in the orb of the moon. Original key book by Bose, in which he began to discuss these questions, is entitled Cosmic and Metacosmic Theology in Aristotle's Lost Dialogues, 1989. Do I have this? We can pause. I probably don't have it. I'll have to check later. Shouldn't be wasting too much time on that. But Bose has worked steadily on the subject since that time and continues to find out more and more about the subject. In the book just mentioned here, Bose tells us of Aristotle's fifth element. Quote, this new element is, according to Aristotle, a soma, physicality, and can therefore be counted among the natural stomata, quote unquote, plural of soma. Did I say stomata? I mean somata. But but it does not share the hyle substance of the four earthly corpora elements. For this reason, it is described as a a hylon, possessing no hyle or physical body, as a kind of immaterial matter, quote unquote. While maintaining his belief in the divinity of the celestials, divine beings, and their eternal existence, Aristotle bases this stance on his own new theory of the fifth element. The celestial spheres consist of the divine fifth element, quote unquote. Aristotle also believed that the divine beings, as well as human spirits, were made of the fifth element, and that when we die, our spirits made of the fifth element return to the world of the fifth element, which he conceived of as being somewhere above the atmosphere. And of course, he viewed all stars and the sun as being made of aether, and he distinctly postulated under the name of pneuma the existence of a form of the fifth element within animal and human bodies as an animating principle, for the details of which see the footnote. These beliefs of his later had an influence on the fundamental concepts of Christian theology, especially the Gospel of John. I won't go into more detail here about these ancient ideas, as fascinating as they are, but I want readers to know that more than 2,200 years before Crookes uh, discovered his fourth state of matter, quote unquote, Aristotle had predicted it. That is more than a footnote to history. It is an extraordinary fact. I say Aristotle was the first Western thinker to suggest such a thing because the Chinese philosophers of Taoism never accepted a dichotomy between matter and spirit. Monism, in other words. Such a dichotomy is entirely a Western phenomenon. The Chinese have always maintained that spirits, quote unquote, were made of a very special rarefied kind of matter like a mist. So deep do these concepts go in Chinese thinking that it is very difficult to find a Chinese person alive today who does not believe in ghosts, quote unquote, implicitly. They always seem to have believed that very wise people never really died, but that their physical forms were transmuted into what they called Xian, uh, spelled Hsien in the old spelling, Xian. I don't know. My apologies. Which is pronounced similarly to Shen. So I was kind of close. Xian. These wise deceased shamans were conceived of as living in remote mountains and forests and flying through the air and the clouds with the greatest of ease, thinking profound thoughts and enjoying the delights of heavenly contemplation. As for most other people, they became ghosts, which were a lower grade of being, but also made of the same rarefied semi-matter. Psychologically disturbed ghosts were dangerous and they haunted people and places. The female ones were the most dangerous of all and were known as fox fairies, quote unquote. They would lure men to their doom and destroy them like vampires. Oh, that reminds me of some other things, but I'm not going to get into that. Let's just say the Lilitu as a hint. A very large portion of Chinese fiction over the ages has taken the form of ghost stories because of the Chinese preoccupation with rarefied entities made of what we would today would call plasma. Anyone who enjoys atmospheric ghost stories should read those by the most famous Chinese author of them, Pu Songlin, 1640 to 1715. One of my favorite authors, and whose house I have visited in Shandong Province. However, living in the Western world all as we do, I do not propose to write a history of the Chinese beliefs in ghosts through the ages, or even the various texts that discuss such matters, or how they also anticipated modern plasma in a somewhat vague manner. I thought it important to mention it, for the history of the world does not consist solely of the history of the West, but I will pass over the Chinese sources because it would require a lengthy account indeed to explain the differences between Chinese and Western thinking, which is a vast chasm of incomprehension, alas, and impossible to explain in a short space. Indeed, suffice it to say that a plasma world would be less surprising to the Chinese than to Westerners. As for genuinely proto-scientific speculations anticipating plasma, I am not aware of the Chinese having produced any. It was the Taoists, old spelling Taoists, with the T instead of the D, but it was still pronounced with the D, who promoted these ideas. They were well aware that the physical sense of sight was incapable of perceiving certain forms of matter which were invisible. Lazy, lazy. No, 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 no. Lei Zhu, 5th century BC, says that rarefied matter, quote, eludes the senses of sight, hearing, and touch, and is therefore called by the name of yi, end quote. The Chinese character for this yi is the same as is used in the title of the famous divination book called Yi Jing. old spelling, I Ching, Yi Ching, the book of change, quote unquote, and therefore also has the meaning of change, quote unquote, or one might better say what changes, quote unquote. Lao Tzu, uncertain whether sixth or 4th century BC, the founder of Taoism, speaks of the invisible primeval matter in this way, quote, the likeness of things unseen, the form of that which is without body, end quote. And he says, quote, what you cannot see by looking at it is called he, rarefaction or vacancy. That which eludes the sense of sight is called he, quote unquote, end quote. He also says that he and ye are the same. However, we must resist the temptation to investigate these Chinese Taoism, investigate Chinese Taoism further, as it is an endless subject. The point to note here is that Lao Tzu attributed bodiless form to what we now call plasma. He was thus not simply speaking of some primeval sledge invisibly sloshing around us like an undifferentiated sea, but he was aware of it, that it must be structured. One could stretch a point and say this is the ancient prehistory of the concept of a plasma crystal. Before we leave the ancient teachings on plasma, I want to return briefly to recent discoveries, which we discussed in Chapter 4, that plasmas precipitate matter, and that matter is also otherwise precipitated out of nothing, quote unquote. These recent scientific discoveries also resonate with ancient wisdom. Various religions from different parts of the world suggest the creation of matter as coming from speech, quote unquote. In Christianity, we are told, quote, in the beginning was the Word, Logos, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made, end quote. In the earliest form of Hinduism, the universe was said to be created by Brahma, who is an all-embracing universal spirit. He opened his mouth to speak, and he spoke the four Vedas, which are the ancient collections of sacred hymns that the Aryans brought with them from Iran when they invaded India from the west circa 1500 BC. The Vedas are considered the most sacred of the Hindu scriptures and are written in an archaic form of Sanskrit known as Vedic. In ancient Egypt, the god Ta, uh, I don't know how to pronounce that, was said to have created the world by his speech. The wall texts of the tomb of Ramses the Seventh in the Valley of the Kings state of the sun, quote, his speech is light, end quote. And in the ancient Egyptian text known as the Book of Caverns, which was preserved in the transverse chamber of the Osirian at Abydos, we read of the sun whose name is Re. Quote, Re speaks to them through his light, end quote. The ancient mystical concept of the Logos in Johannine Christianity also suggests that the word, quote unquote, of God was light. Sacred speech is essentially something that emerges from something else, just as our breath is emitted from us into the air around us. It seems that the ancient peoples, when referring to the creative speech of the primal God, were trying to convey the concept of expelled structured breath entering into a surrounding medium, but retaining its own form, and thus constituting matter. Since we now know that the universe is a seething ocean of plasma, And as it has now been proven that plasma makes dust and that dust is matter, it is legitimate to consider that the material universe, quote unquote, has been extruded from and created by the universal plasma. In other words, the 1% is the creation of the 99%. And look at from and looked at from that perspective, the traditional religious views of the certain matter of a certain and tongue-tied or something. The traditional religious views of the creation of matter are justified, for the spontaneously formed dust and the baryons are the building blocks of the familiar world around us. But if we look back to our ultimate origins in the world of physical matter, we are the children of plasma. The Egyptians would say that we are, quote, the progeny of Ta, end quote. The Christian view is that we are the children of God, quote unquote, and a Hindu might say we are the children, we are the creation of the great universal spirit, Brahma, end quote. The other early creation, excuse me, there we go again, already not even 11 o'clock and I'm already yawning. My apologies. It is interesting to learn of these other these mythologies and religions. Try to have a mosaic of different information at least to study and look into. So anyways, the other early creation legends of, quote, in the beginning was undifferentiated chaos, end quote, or as the ancient Egyptians said, the goddess uh, Nut, I think, who was a great cosmic sea, and the Torah and the Old Testament that speak of the waters, quote unquote, are all effectively saying the same. On this view, all physical matter did indeed emerge from the vast universal sea of plasma. Oh, and that's the end of chapter 6. This seemed kind of an abrupt ending. Okay, well, at least we got through religious examples of what at least Robert Temple would deem as plasma. Whether that's truly justified or not is another story itself. But it seems to point that way with all this uh, language of light and fire, fiery fire, and whatnot. So, chapter 7, Christian Birkeland's miraculous discovery. Christian Birkeland, 1867 to 1917, was famous in Norway, and his picture was until recently on their 200 kroner banknote. So between its appearance in 1994 and its withdrawal in 2018, the Norwegians were reminded of him every day when they went shopping. He was a very brave man who spent years freezing in the Arctic wastes in the north of Norway, making detailed observations of the aurora borealis, or northern lights as they are often called. He concluded that the northern lights, and there are southern ones too at the South Pole, known as the aurora australis, must be caused by streams of charged particles pouring in from the sun towards the Earth's poles. These particles then glow and cause all the beautiful lights. This theory caused the utmost outrage, and astronomers all over the world called Birkeland a madman. Did he not realize that space was empty? Charged particles could not pass through empty space. How dare you? And so instead of facing Birkeland's carefully presented evidence, the world's quote astrophysical community end quote stuck with their insistence upon empty space and decided that Birkeland was a crank. He died unrecognized in 1917. Poor bastard. His theories about the aurora were not proved true until spacecraft verified them in the 1960s. Because Birkeland is one of my heroes, I was active in certain minor ways in helping to facilitate the 2017 Oslo Birkeland Centennial Conference to celebrate his great scientific work. And that's him. He's got kind of sort of rocking a Nietzschean mustache there. When was he? Yeah, he was like contemporary with Nietzsche. He was a bit young though. Nietzsche died in 1900, so he would be what, in his 30s? Oh no, he would have been 33. Sad trombone. Freemasonry confirmed. Or was turning 33. I don't know what day exact what day Nietzsche died or when Brooklyn was born, but anyways, close enough. Christian Birkeland appeared until recently on the Norwegian 200 kroner banknote, image reproduced with the kind permission of the Bank of Norway. Copyright by Norges Bank. Artist Severe. I'm gonna butcher this name. Severe Morken. This banknote was legal tender in Norway between the years 1994 and 2018. Hmm. Before we go into the subject of the solar winds and the Birkeland currents, it is important to know, to have a very brief history of how their existence came to be recognized. And that means knowing how and when the polar aurorae come to our attention and the early attempts to understand them. Naturally, it is the peoples of the north who saw them all the time, and a 13th century Norwegian saga called The King's Mirror, quote unquote, there's no quotes there, uh, Kongesspillet, dated to AD 1220 to 1230, contains a reference to them. It mentions, quote, those lights which the Greenlanders call the Northern Lights, end quote, although the Northern Lights are rarely seen so far south as Greece or Rome. They were certainly witnessed by Aristotle, who described them in his lengthy book Meteorology as, quote, burning flames in the sky. We often see a burning flame of the kind one sees when stubble is being burned on plough land. Sometimes on a clear night, a number of appearances can be seen taking shape in the sky, such as chasms, quote unquote, trenches, quote unquote, and blood red colors. The upper air condenses and takes fire, and its combustion sometimes produces the appearance of a burning fire. End quote. It has been suggested that Aristotle may have seen the aurora borealis twice, in 349 BC and again in 344 BC. We must remember that Aristotle was born and grew up in the north of Greece and lived for some years in Macedonia as an adult as well. Thus, having spent much of his time at a higher latitude than Athens, Aristotle theorized that a vapor rose from the earth that collided with the sun fire above the atmosphere, where it was ignited, and thus produced the colorful flashes of in the sky. He stated that there was a layer of a strange kind of fire, quote unquote, encircling the Earth above the air, thus clearly anticipating the later discovery of the ionosphere by Balfour Stewart in 1887, 2,119 years later, years after the death of Aristotle. The quotation from Aristotle in the footnote is truly astonishing in its anticipation of the nature of the ionosphere. Doop, doopy doop. Aristotle may have been influenced in his thinking by Homer. In the Iliad, Book 2, 412, and Book 3, 277 to 279, Homer describes the chief god Zeus as aether-dwelling, Aetheri Neon. Dion. I don't know if that's pronounced correctly, meaning that he resides in the blazing and dazzling aether of the heavens above the sky. Much is made of this by the first century AD Homeric commentator Heraclitus the grammarian, not to be confused with Heraclitus, the original Heraclitus back in a few hundred years BC, at least. I forget when he lived. This is a different Heraclitus. He's the the grammarian, not to be confused with the famous philosopher of the same name who lives centuries earlier. Yeah, in his work Homeric Problems, he cites this Homeric concept specifically in relation to the Aristotelian tradition. He suggests that the name of Zeus may derive from the word Zesin or Zesin, which means boiling, quote unquote. Because of the intense fiery heat of the aether, he mentions Aristotle's followers saying of aether that it is, quote, distinct from fire, end quote, and, quote, they regard it as a fifth element, end quote. It should be noted that Aristotle made an intensive study of the variant texts of Homer and even traveled to the island of Ithaca to obtain a copy of the Ithacan version of the Odyssey, from which he compiled his own edition of the epic. It was well known in antiquity, though it is now lost. Indeed, it was Aristotle's editions of Homer that Alexander the Great, his pupil, carried with him on his conquests to keep under his pillow every night, as recorded by contemporary historians. The aurorae had been witnessed in Greece prior to Aristotle. Quote, a fiery body of great size, like a burning cloud, was observed in the heavens. End quote. It did not remain at rest, but moved in various directions with violent swaying. End quote. But the earliest surviving written account of this phenomenon is found in the Life of Lysander, 12:4, by Plutarch, AD 646 to 125, 4 centuries after the time of Aristotle. Aristotle's text is therefore the earliest surviving text in the world referring to the aurora borealis. And of course, he did not merely describe the aurorae, he attempted to explain them scientifically as well. Both Seneca, 4 BC to AD 65, in his Natural Questions, Book 1, Section 14, verse 1, and Pliny, AD 23 to 79, in his Natural History described the northern lights. But after that, apparently nothing was published about them for approximately 1500 years. The Norwegian saga mentioned earlier being, of course, an oral saga, not a publication. The astronomer Tycho Brahe, 1546 to 1601, man, that's a jump, mentioned them in passing. The astronomer Johannes Kepler, 1571 to 1630, witnessed and described them, and Galileo, 1564 to 1642, witnessed them at Venice in 1621. It was apparent that apparently Galileo, who introduced the name Aurora Borealis in a publication of 1616, though in a descriptive sense rather than with an intention of naming them, and it is not known whether he had actually seen them yet. It is thus not clear that whether Galileo should be credited for naming the aurora borealis, or whether that honor belongs to Pierre Gassendi, who is usually credited with it, and who who had obviously read Galileo and seen his descriptive reference. Perhaps we should split the credit between them. In 1619, Galileo attempted to explain the northern lights with similar ideas to those of Aristotle. Um, it was in the same year of the Venice auroral display 1621 that the French scientist, scholar and philosopher Pierre Gassendi, 1592 to 1655, headset conked out again. We're gonna pause for a second here. Anyway, where were we? Gassendi, Galileo, and etc. Um, Perhaps we would split the credit between them. In 1619, Galileo attempted to explain the northern lights with similar ideas to those of Aristotle. It was in the same year that, excuse me, it was in the same year of the Venice auroral display, 1621, that the French scientist, scholar, and philosopher Pierre Gassendi, 1592 to 1655, formally used the name Aurora Borealis to quote unquote to refer to the northern lights in honor of the ancient Greek goddess of the dawn, Aurora. Gassendi was a keen observer of the heavens, including studying sunspots and observing the transit of Mercury across the sun. He even successfully predicted an eclipse in 1654. Looks like a year before his death, or so. He was only 29 years old when he named quote unquote the Aurora Borealis, despite the fact that he had apparently not then seen the northern lights personally. It is believed he came to know of them through his early friendship with the astronomer uh, Joseph Gaultier de la Villette, 1564 to 1647, and by reading the same accounts of them by Galileo. In 1640, Spanish colonizers in Chile recorded a large auroral display and in the southern skies, which lasted from the beginning of February to the end of April. Man, that's pretty long. But this remained only a locally known matter in Chile for the next 142 years, for it was only in 1782 that the Chilean Jesuit priest Juan Ignacio Molina, S.J., 1740 to 1829 became the first European to report in print this and other subsequent Spanish accounts of the existence of a southern aurora, which was otherwise unknown in Europe. In 1716, a German professor of both theology and mathematics named Christoph Langensen, 1691 to 1770, published a pamphlet in Latin at Königsberg. Isn't that the same place where Kant lived? Königsberg or Königsberg. I'm going to butcher this. Entitled De Aurora Boreali quam Germani das Nordlicht Appellant, and quote unquote, concerning the Aurora Borealis, which the Germans call the Northern Lights, containing an impressive fold-out engraving of particularly bizarre auroral phenomena, which I have reproduced overleaf, along with a scan of the title page. For a second, I thought my headset was off and I was talking for no reason. Sad trombone. I bought a fragmentary copy of this booklet, only the first 10 pages of the extremely rare 28-page work, but fortunately the illustration was present. The work appears to suggest that the aurora borealis is a spiritual phenomenon, which is hardly surprising in that the author was not only a theologian, but a practicing preacher who was 5 times a rector of a Lutheran church. The author refers to the numerous publications by earlier authors. Excuse me. Hiccups. Including Girolamo Cardano, Felipe de la Hire, Valentin Vigelius, Giovanni Domenico Cassini, Giovanni Battista Riccioli, Schmeider, unknown which Schmeider is meant, and Rene Descartes. Frankly, this suggests that there may have been a great deal of discussion of the aurorae going on during this time, of which I have no knowledge, although it would certainly be an interesting subject to investigate for someone who cares to go into the matter in greater depth to see what all these people were saying. This is a wonderful subject for somebody's future PhD thesis. And here's the book. Cristoforo. I guess like Latin version of his name. Dang, that's some crazy ass shit, bro. He's got like little like measurements or something. Straight lines though? That's crazy. That can't be right. Or like the straight lines like maybe signifying sun rays, but you see the northern lights at night. I don't know what I'm saying here. This is an interesting woodcut or whatever he said it was. Anyways, figure 7 and 8, the title page and the fold out engraving, that's what he said, engraving, of the 1716 publication of the Aurora Borealis by Christoph Langensen, from my imperfect copy of this rare work. That's pretty rare, yeah. A forerunner of Christian Birkeland, whose publications have been largely forgotten is an earlier French scientist who seems to be remembered today only in France itself. His name is Jean-Jacques D'Artoux de Mairon. Probably mispronounced that. Apologies. 1678 to 1771. He was active in many fields of science, but even amongst the French, it seems to be little known today that he was the first person in the history of science to suggest that material from the sun was not only being transmitted across space to the Earth, but actually deposited within the Earth's atmosphere. His magnum opus on this subject was a very lengthy book with many illustrations entitled Traité physique et historique de l'aurore boreale, published in 1735. This material was widely circulated in Europe at the time, and the book was translated into German in 1753. De Mairon stated that material from the solar atmosphere crossed space, reached the Earth, and caused the aurora borealis in our own atmosphere. He claims that the atmosphere of the sun was a light and tenuous fluid, which, quote, reached as far as the Earth, end quote. This is a surprisingly accurate guess from a man of the 18th century, since it is reasonable to describe plasma flows as, quote, a light and tenuous fluid, end quote. His words translated are, quote, the matter composing this solar atmosphere coming to meet the upper parts of our air fills into the terrestrial atmosphere more or less at more or less depth. Hmm. Got these different signifiers or something. Be like a geocentric model, maybe, but not after Galileo, probably. Figure 9, this engraving of 1733 shows the sun's atmosphere, quote unquote. Oh, the sun's atmosphere, heliocentric now, as conceived of by de Mairon, extending from the sun, shown in the center and labeled with the capital letter S, to the orbit of the Earth, orbite de la Terre. The solar atmosphere is represented in the drawing by the shaded portion. Okay, like the sun's atmosphere. S. Where are we? The solar atmosphere is represented drawing portion. Da 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 da. Comprise the orbit of the Earth. On page 22 of his book, De Mairon describes the solar atmosphere as being, quote, a spheroid which has been flattened at its edge into the form of a circular disk, end quote. De Mairon's concept of the solar atmosphere that reached the Earth partially arose from the researches by his Swiss contemporary Nicolas Fatio de Duillier. I don't know how to pronounce that. 1664 to 1753, whom he calls simply Fatio, quote unquote, concerning the distance between the Earth and the Sun. In his own caption of De Maran says, quote, this represents the atmosphere of the Sun. It is projected on a map of the equator and on one section of the concavity of the boreal hemisphere of the sky. The center is superimposed upon the axis of the sun, projected onto the astral pole at such a distance that this atmosphere is viewed at a single at an angle of 45 degrees. End quote. From Jean-Jacques Desarteux de Maran, Traité physique et historique des aurorae boreales, physic, uh, physical and historical treatise concerning the aurora borealis, Paris, 1733. The second folding plate following, page 32. Since de Mauron first announced these ideas in 1731 to the Royal Academy of Sciences in Paris, he anticipated Christian Birkeland's first announcement of similar ideas, which also took place in Paris in 1900 by 169 years. De Mauron also published many illustrations, including some spectacular ones of the aurorae. He may probably thus be credited with being the first predictor of what we now call solar wind. In 1767, Nud Leem (1697 to 1774) published a book in Danish entitled, in translation, An Account of the Lapse of Finnmarken. In it, he described how the Lapps of Lapland in the far north go hunting with guns for foxes by the light of the aurora borealis. He said, "This quote, this kind of sport the Lapps pursue at night when the moon is up, or when there is an aurora borealis, which in that country during the winter nights when the air is clear is as intense as if the sky were on fire, and which in a manner shines like the most brilliant moonlight." End quote. Leem even published an engraving of the Lapps doing this, depicting the auroral streaks in the sky behind them, providing the necessary illumination. This and the Langenson illustration of 1717 are surely two of the earliest depictions of the aurora borealis ever published. It's a kind of a crazy engraving. The one guy looks like he kind of has a Phrygian hat on, maybe. Got ourselves like it's like a coyote or like a fox. Figure 10, Nudleem's drawing of 1767 showing the Lapps of Lapland hunting foxes on the ice at night by the light of the aurora borealis. That's some light, bro. In 1745, long before Molina's publication, the mariner Antonio de Ulloa y de la Torre-Giral (1716 to 1795) witnessed the southern aurora from his ship as he rounded Cape Horn, but his reports of this appear to have remained oral ones amongst sailors until long afterwards. In 1770, Captain James Cook (1728 to 1779) observed the southern aurora on his first voyage to Australia, but this seems not to have been reported in print at the same time, and to have remained recorded only in his log. In 1773, Captain Cook, what a name, Captain Cook, observed the southern aurora again on his second voyage to Australia, and he gave the southern lights the name of aurora australis, quote unquote. Cook died 3 years before Molina's publication publicly reported the existence of the Southern Lights. In 1812, the English scientist Sir Humphrey Davy (1778 to 1829) published his opinion in his essay of electrical attraction and repulsion and their relation to climate chemical changes, end quote. That, quote, coruscation, flashing and glittering of the aurora borealis and australis precisely precisely resemble strong artificial electricity discharged through rare air. The auroras may arise from a discharge of electricity accumulated in the atmosphere near the poles. In 1845, inspired by and referring back to Sir Humphrey Davy, Baron Karl von Reichenbach, 17, what a name, Baron Karl von Reichenbach, 1788 to 1869, published his theory in German, published in English in 1850, that the aurora borealis, quote, appears to be nothing else than an electric phenomenon caused by the magnetism of the earth, end quote. He constructed terrelles, meaning small magnetic spheres, as a miniature models of the earth, which had generated lights at their two magnetic poles. In this, he anticipated by many decades Berglund currents, more sophisticated and famous experiments in Norway. Berglund also constructed terrelles. I don't know if there's a typo because in one place it's with an E. Where'd it go? See, there it's spelled with an E, but over here it's spelled with an A. So I don't know if this is singular, even though it has an S at the end, or if this is, oh, this is definitely plural. But I don't know if this is singular or plural. Anyway, to replace the auroral effects with miniature spheres containing an electromagnetic in their interiors. In 1862, the Swiss physicist Arthur Auguste de la Rive (1801 to 1873) published a paper concerning both the northern and southern aurorae. He had been studying the aurorae since 1849. Nearly a century passed after Molina's publication before any major developments concerning a sound understanding of the aurorae appeared to have taken place, however. In 1878, Carl C. Lemstrom, 1838 to 1904, a Finnish geophysicist of Swedish extraction, published an article in Swedish in a Finnish periodical based upon his external observations of the northern lights in Scandinavia. His article, he reported that as a result of his studies over a considerable time, he had come to the conclusion that the auroral phenomena varied from the sunspot cycle of 11 years. That that is a cycle which during which the sun goes from having a maximum of sunspots to having a minimum of them and back again. No one knows why it happened. No one knows why it does that. At the time of writing, we are at the minimum. He said that, in his opinion, the aurorae were caused by electrical currents in the Earth's atmosphere, which were stimulated by what he called heart rays, quote unquote, coming from the sun. Electric currents were still imperfectly understood at this time, and it was only when this same year, 1878, that Henry Augustus Rowland, 1848-1901, carried his famous Rowland experiment, which he showed, which showed that electrical current consists of moving charges. Yeah. Not knowing about charged particles constituting the electric currents, Limstrom was in no positive was in no position rather to conceive of electric currents as charged particles actually coming from the sun. He also still thought that space was empty, which must be why he could only consist of heart rays, quote unquote, coming from the sun. But Lemstrom was an important precursor to Birkeland, who took his work very seriously. Lemstrom published his book, quote unquote, Les Aurores Boreales, Étude Générale des Phénomènes produits par les courants électriques de l'atmosphère, butchering the French language. The aurora borealis, a general study of the phenomena produced by the electric currents of the atmosphere, end quote, in 1886. Whoa, that's crazy. Again, with the with the sort of straight lines, obviously they're warped as farther you go out, but still. One Figure 11, one of the many spectacular color illustrations of the aurora borealis published by Limstrom. The next year after the publication of Lemstrom's original article in 1879, the Danish scientist and photographer Sophus Tromholdt (1852 to 1896) noticed when he was visiting Lapland in Norway that the area of sky covered by the aurora borealis increased in size and spread southwards when the solar activity increased by in accordance with the 11-year sunspot cycle, thus confirming Selim Lemstrom's assertion that the previous year regarding the clear association of the aurora borealis some kind of some kind of solar influence created in Lemstrom called changes in the solar surface, quote unquote, i.e. the sunspots. Oh, that's crazy. The next year after the publication of Lemstrom's original article in 1879, the Danish scientist photographer Sophus Tromholdt (1852 to 1896) noticed when he was visiting Lapland in Norway that the area of sky covered by the aurora borealis increased in size and spread southwards when solar activity increased in accordance with the 11-year sunspot cycle, thus confirming Lemstrom's assertion that the previous year regarding this clear association of the aurora borealis with some kind of solar influence correlated with what I called Limstrom changes in the solar surface, i.e., the sunspots. In 1885, Trumholtz published a massive two-volume work in English called "Under the Rays of the Radar of the Aurora Borealis," containing 150 illustrations. Selim Limstrom and his work are where am I? Sunspots. In 1885, Trumholtz published a massive two-volume work in English titled "Under the Rays of the Aurora Borealis," containing 150 illustrations. Selim Limstrom and his work are mentioned, but the names of Kristen Birkeland and another auroral researcher, the Danish scientist Adam Poulsen, are not. Poulsen had begun publishing in France in French. His important published Tremholt published in a remarkable image of Limstrom's amazing experiments in producing an aurora shooting shooting into the kind of experiments in producing artificial aurorae shooting up into the sky and then from a mountaintop took place in 1882. Figure 12. Tromholtz's depiction of Lemstrom's experiment in 1882. It's like ET phone home or some shit. A major advance in understanding the electrical nature of the Earth's atmosphere took place 3 years after this, when in 1882 Balfour Stewart (1828 to 1887) suggested that there was an entire electrically conducting layer living above the air and cutting across the Earth's vertical magnetic field, thus being the first person to suggest the existence of we what we now call the ionosphere, since the time when it had been first suggested by Aristotle. In 1884, the Danish scientist Adam F. W. Paulsen (1883 to 1907) published his account of the Danish polar expedition of 1882 to 1883, and in the same year, Adolf Erik Nordenskjold Paulsen account 1882 to 1883, and in the same year, Adolf Erik Nordenskjold (1832 to 1901) was a Swedish Finn, published an elaborate account in French "Sur les aurores boreales" on the aurora borealis in a French scientific journal, extracted from his account of the Vega expedition to the north during the winter of 1878 and 1879. His original extract concerning the baby. his original extract concerning the aurora borealis having been published 2 years earlier in 1882 by in Swedish. The Vega, the Vega was the name of the ship on which he sailed. He sailed. Oh dear, which he sailed in search of a northeast passage, and on which he got frozen into the ice near the Bering Strait. So he had plenty of time to observe the northern lights as he sat there trapped. There were many interesting illustrations published by Nordenskjöld. The accounts by Poulsen and Nordenskjöld are exactly important, and although I have their own publications, including even two personally signed by Poulsen, in the interests of brevity, I shall refrain from discussing them here. A typical observation by Poulsen is that the electric currents in the atmosphere were strong in the winter and weak in the spring. The conscientious and diligent attempts by these two men to gather information concerning the aurora were a specific part of the progress in understanding the phenomena. Another figure with the degrees, maybe. Are large, arc large, a something or other. Figure 13, and an illustration shown by Nordenskjöld in specific form, or in scientific form, all with all the angular measurements precisely given, and the yoga stuck in the ice. Stuck in ice. And here's another one. Figure 14, Nordenskjöld's plotting of the regions of the Earth where visibility of the aurora borealis had been reported. The North Pole is shown in the center. In 1896, Christian Birkeland, we finally get to him, sheesh, all this background. One of the most brilliant scientists of his time began publishing the great breakthroughs. He hypothesized that the sun emits rays of electricity, cathode rays, quote unquote, which reach the earth and are, quote, the object of a suction by the earth's magnetic poles, end quote, and that there is a correlation between sunspots and earth's polar aurorae and terrestrial magnetic perturbations. Birkeland's theories are expressed in 1896, who are not well known, as they are mentioned in an exceedingly rare book of his published in French in 1901. I purchased a copy of this book from a book dealer in Paris. It was not inscribed by Birkeland to his friend, the famous French scientist Henri Becquerel, 1852 to 1908, winner of the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1903, who discovered radioactivity, and and it and and it had thus obviously come from Becquerel, personal library, Becquerel's personal library. When I sent an email to Professor Alf England in Oslo, with whom I was then frequently in touch, telling him about this find. He said it was the only one of Berkland's publications of which there was no known copy in Norway, and he had never seen it, although he had listed it in his bibliography of Berkland's applications. Alf is the biographer of Berkland and the world's leading expert on him. A popular book about Berkland by Lucy Yago, entitled "The Northern Lights", was published in 2001 but without footnotes or references. In the selected bibliography, Yago does list the 1901 book by Berkland, who presumably she consulted the single copy of the book that is in the British Library. It is possible that there are only two copies in existence today, mine and that one. Yago begins her book dramatically with a description of events in Finnmark during 1899 expedition. As a result of my discovery of the little-known book, I now know that Berkland formulated his theories of electric currents coming from the sun many years earlier than that had been taught. When discussing these theories of Berkland, people generally cite his well-known book published in English in two installments in 1908 and 1913, concerning the Norwegian aurora polar expression of 1902 to 1903, which is widely available today in numerous print-on-demand reprint editions. But that was the third such expedition, and the book that I discovered concerns his earlier expedition of 1899 to 1900, and it contains sections on, quote, electric current in the higher layers of the atmosphere, end quote, 16 pages, artificial aurora bands, quote unquote, 20 pages, etc. It pushes back the timetable of current of Berkland's lights considerably from what we had to assumed, and shows how many more years he labored at these ideas than had been thought, as an example of how incorrect dates can spread and become accepted without question amongst the scientific community. We see this in Alexandria PL's excellent book Plasma Physics, published in 2010. The space between sun and earth and is filled it's the examples of how incorrect dates can spread and become accepted without question amongst the scientific community. We see this statement in Alexandria PL's excellent book Plasma Physics, published in 2010. The space between Sun and Earth is filled with the plasmas of the solar wind. Is this flow charged with the sum whose first conjectured in 1908 by the time the Norwegian physicist Christian Berkland. do here. But Brooklyn first published his conjectures, quote unquote, on this subject in 1896, 12 years earlier than PL believes. And it appears that everyone has been assuming that Berklin's 1908 book was his original publication of these ideas. What is important for us here, and what makes Berkeley one of the greatest heroes of this history, of this story, is that having followed in the footsteps of near contemporary crooks, including the Earth, magnetic poles in a similar way. He developed a theory in which energetic electrons were ejected from sunspots on the solar surface, directed to the Earth and guided to the Earth's polar regions by the geomagnetic field where they produced an invisible aurora. Birkeland also may have been the first to predict that plasma is ubiquitous in space. He wrote, quote, "It seems to be a natural consequence of our points of view to assume that the whole story is." Sheesh, where am I? What is important for us here, and what makes Brooklyn of the great heroes of this story, is that having followed in the footsteps of his near contemporary crooks in studying the influence of magnets on cathode rays in vacuums, he conjectured that electron beams from the sun were being guided towards the Earth at magnetic poles in a similar way. He developed a theory in which energetic electrons were ejected from sunspots on the solar surface, directed to the Earth, and guided to the Earth's polar regions by the geomagnetic field where they produced the visible aurora. In 1913, Birkeland also may have been the first to predict that plasma is ubiquitous in space. He wrote, quote, "It seems to be a natural consequence of our points of view to assume that the world of space is filled with electrons and flying electric ions of all kinds. We have assumed that each stellar system in evolutions through uh, through throughs and throws off electric corpuscles into space. It does not seem uh, unreasonable therefore to think that the greater part of the material masses in the universe is found not in the solar uh, solar systems of or nebulae, quote unquote, in but in empty space, quoted on Wikipedia with no reference. In 1916, Birkeland was probably the first person to predict successfully that the solar wind behaves as do all charged particles in an electric field. Quote, "From a physical point of view, it is most probable that these new solar rays are neither exclusively negative, uh, consists of both negative electrons. No, So it's line a line above it. New solar rays are neither exclusively negative nor positive rays, but both kinds, quote unquote. In other words, the solar wind consists of both negative electrons and positive protons and ions. The quote is from Wikipedia with no proper reference. Well, isn't that just dandy? I shall not tell the fascinating story of Christian Birkeland's life because that has already been done. Lucy Yago's book about Birkeland, the man is uh, the man is a good place to start, and Alv Egeland's book about Birkeland, the scientist, gives all the other important information one needs. Since Birkeland was such an outstanding genius, both books are highly recommended as more need to know about him. Sir Isaac Newton, 1643 to 1727. Science and the world had moved toward a material mechanical view of the universe, picturing solid objects in dead, empty space held in orbit by gravity. It was a picture to inspire a certain cold wonder, perhaps. Gravity was king here. Then Birkeland discovered that electric currents traveling from the sun were entering Earth's uh, were entering Earth's atmosphere. This was a profound and important mystery because electricity can't cross empty space. It would be another 40 years before two scientific geniuses solved this mystery and began to. It would be another 40 years before two scientific geniuses solved this mystery and began to build up a picture of the universe filled with a web of electrical impulses like macroscopic brain. And that is the end of chapter 7. Hold on a second, folks. Where'd it go? Where did it go? Well, whatever, I forget. Yeah. So that's it for this segment of the A New Science of Heaven by Robert Temple. Hopefully I was able to get through it with relatively easy. My apologies for any misgivings in the reading.